It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by emailrevealer.com. That's my website. Also, too, if this is the first time you're listening to our show, I invite you to check out OppermanReport.com. We have a brand new members section. We have a bookstore we just put up, but a brand new members section where you can subscribe and become a member. And there's original content on there, all new shows, exclusive to subscribing members. Also, too, I have a really big special going on right now. If you go there and you check it out and you like it, shoot me a PayPal. Shoot me an email directly through PayPal, and I'll give you a year for $60. So we're knocking $15 off. This is a little limited time offer we're giving you here because I got to run out and buy a car this week. I got to get a car. I've been limping around enough. Okay, very excited tonight. We have Graeme MacQueen. He's the author of 2001 Anthrax Deception, the case for a domestic conspiracy. Now, this is, again, you guys know how interested I am in the whole Anthrax case, and this is kind of a follow-up to our Richard Lambert report that we did with Richard Lambert, who was the FBI director in charge of the Anthrax investigation. We had him on a couple of months ago. Graeme's website that he's on is called consensus911.org. So, Graeme, are you there?
I'm here. Hi.
How are you? So nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get into the book, into Anthrax.
Well, okay, I'll try and keep it short. Let's see. I'm a Canadian. Brought up in Canada, but ended up doing a PhD in the U.S. So I lived in the U.S. for several years, did a doctorate at Harvard. Back then it was comparative religion with a specialization in Buddhist studies. Then I got a job back in Canada, teaching at university, and I held that job for 30 years. But for the last bunch of years, I wasn't doing my comparative religion so much as peace and conflict studies. And I was the founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at my university. I was involved in several projects doing peace-building activities in war zones, and so on and so forth. I took early retirement after being a prof for about 30 years and have been kind of an independent researcher since then, and have spent about the last 10 years studying the war on terror, which I think is an extremely fraudulent construction. And that includes 9/11, it includes the Anthrax attacks, and a whole series of things since then. So that's kind of who I am right now.
Now, that's interesting, because you said you were a professor for 30 years.
Yeah.
You don't look that... How old are you?
We're getting into details and, private, stuff here. No, I'm 67 now.
67. Okay, you look great, man. You look great.
That you're probably looking at, an old photo.
The picture's 30 years old. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, I guess the thing is about the whole we just had the anniversary of 9/11.
Right.
So it's just about the anniversary of Anthrax right now, because it was about a week later.
That's right.
So now, what do you make of this? Why do you think, first of all, it's so overlooked? No one talks about it.
Well, actually, I hadn't thought of it till you mentioned it, but this is probably the actual anniversary, September 18th, of the first Anthrax letter sent out. So it is a very appropriate time to be having this conversation. Sorry, did you ask me what what did you ask me?
It's funny because we just got lucky because neither one of us thought of it.
That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, why don't you tell me?
Did you ask me why it's overlooked? Was that a question?
Yeah, but before we get to that, because there's so many audiences, young kids and stuff, these whippersnappers, why don't you tell us what the Anthrax case was and what happened, what it's about?
Okay, well, I hope that most people remember the 9/11 attacks, although I realize that even those are receding into the distance, and there may be some viewers who don't actually remember. But obviously they were hugely important in founding if not the war on terror, then at least this most recent phase of it. The Anthrax attacks began, formally at least, about a week after the 9/11 attacks. That's why today would be roughly the anniversary of the beginning of the Anthrax attacks. Anthrax is a word that refers to a lethal disease. So we can say somebody contracted anthrax, they got anthrax. It also it's a little bit of a confusing term because sometimes the term is also used to refer to the actual bacteria, especially in the form of spores. So people will say that anthrax was sent in letters. Obviously, I don't mean the disease was sent in letters. They mean the spores, this particular form of the bacteria was sent in letters. So around September 18th, some people, in my view, because I think it was more than one person, sent anthrax spores, put it in envelopes, and began sending it out in the U.S. And the anthrax attacks, or anthrax letter attacks, then extended from then till late November 2001. And altogether, at least 22 people got the disease in one form or another. 5 died. Some people think it was a lot more than 22 that got it, but anyway, at least 22. And it was really, really important for a number of reasons. For one thing, many Americans probably forget that U.S. Congress was attacked with a weapon of mass destruction. I mean, that's kind of a big deal. It's kind of weird to forget that, but that's really what happened in the fall of 2001. I mean, a bioweapon was classed at the time, still is generally, as a weapon of mass destruction. And, we hear a lot about WMD here and there. People forget that this was actually used in Congress, that these letters were sent to 2 senators. And it wasn't just a random thing. I think it was very clear why it was sent to senators. And I trace this in detail in my book. I believe it was to get the Patriot Act passed very, very quickly, and also to support military adventures abroad. But anyway, here I'm getting into my interpretation. When we stick to fact, we'll just say, well, the letters were sent to news media. They were sent to these 2 particular Democratic senators. A bunch of people died, ordinary U.S. citizens, and then they stopped. So that's the gist. Oh, I suppose I should say, we can get into who the perpetrators may have been later. The FBI claims to have closed the case, and they say that it was a lone wolf terrorist, man by the name of Bruce Ivans, who is now dead, and that he did it, and that's the end of the story. And, of course, in my book I say, no, it's not the end of the story, and he's not the culprit.
Right. So the thing is, when I was talking to Richard Lambert, especially, we were talking about this, that it would seem that the motivation was to create the Patriot Act and all this stuff, and there were so many other indicators, like weren't members of Congress already on CIPRO before the anthrax was mailed out?
Well, the White House certainly was put on CIPRO. Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, and others were put apparently on CIPRO. And just for your listeners, CIPRO is a powerful antibiotic. Anthrax is a bacterium, and so you fight it with antibiotics. If you want to cure anthrax, when someone gets it, you can give them a powerful antibiotic, but also if you give it to them in advance, it may prevent them from getting the disease. So it's used preventively, and Mr. Bush and Cheney and various others were put on CIPRO on September 11th, 2001, about a week before the first letter was sent out. As for members of Congress, that's more complicated, and I'm not sure. I don't think there was any blanket policy of putting them on CIPRO in those early days after 9/11, but some of them probably chose to go on CIPRO, because we'll get into that later. But there was clearly foreknowledge of these attacks. There was an anthrax scare happening before before any victims were actually identified. It's very peculiar. So yeah, there were probably some members of Congress on it, but I think most of them were not.
Now, it's interesting to me that when you read the side effects of this Cipro, confusion, delusions, amnesia, practically, insomnia, diarrhea,
right.
like the nausea. Like, to be put on this stuff when we just had this big attack on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon, and now suddenly all the people in decision-making power is on this drug that causes confusion.
Well, yeah, and diarrhea, that's not very good either.
Yeah, you can't find your way to the toilet.
That's right. Yeah, well, I suppose I hadn't thought of the confusion part, but the part that I had wondered about is that it does have side effects, and you have to be on it. I don't remember how long. I think it's at least a month for it to have the serious preventive effect against anthrax, so you don't just go on it for a couple of days. And it's not something you would go on lightly, for a length of time. So you have to ask the question as to why they were put on Cipro on September 11th. It's a perfectly valid question. Of course, they will claim that was all just protocol, that, when there's a terrorist attack, like a 9/11, there's certain things you do. One of them is that you assume there may be a WMD attack coming up, so you put the president on all these things. I think there are very good reasons. There's good evidence that that's false, that that's not the explanation. But that's the explanation you'll be given.
Now, another thing I took note of with Richard Lampert was that he mentioned that Dick Cheney was in daily contact with him trying to figure out what was going on. Now, I guess the conventional wisdom amongst people like us is that he knew what was going on. If anybody knew, Cheney knew what was going on.
Yeah. Well, I don't pretend to, like I'm not all-seeing and all-knowing, and I don't pretend to know what role Mr. Cheney may have played in this.
Yeah.
But he certainly spent a lot of time, as you probably know, after 9/11, for quite a while after that, at least a couple of months, I think, largely out of the public eye in an undisclosed location. In other words, he was in some secret place, and then he would appear from time to time, like to give a talk or, let's say a policy talk, or have a lunch with senators, or, give a talk at an important dinner in the Waldorf Astoria or something. But he basically was out of the public eye while a large part of the anthrax attacks were unfolding. Now, whether he was, managing the anthrax attacks or trying to protect the country against the anthrax attacks, these are things that I don't pretend to know. But, of course, I don't, unfortunately, trust him. I believe he was one of those who was implicated in both sets of attacks in the fall of 2001.
Okay, what do you make of the people that were the targets of the attacks? Is there a pattern that we can look at there?
Well, the news media were targeted, and several people in the news media got the disease to a greater or lesser extent. In some cases, it's not surprising, ABC, NBC. If you want to cause panic in the U.S. population, then try to cause panic in the major news network, and they will then relay that, and that's precisely what they did. They talked endlessly about anthrax anxiety, anthrax fear. We're all terrified. We're all, oh my God, this is terrible. What are we going to do? I mean, if I wanted to cause panic in a population, I'd probably try to intimidate the major news media, and I think that's probably why they were targeted. I don't know why Robert Stevens, the first man who died of anthrax, was targeted. He was small fry. He was a photo editor at a tabloid in Florida. There are other connections to that tabloid that we might explore later, which might explain it. As for the people who died, the 5 people who died, I don't think they were specifically targeted at all. I think they were innocent victims. That's one of the things that's scary about sending out letters with anthrax. Anybody could get it. Two of the people who died were postal workers. They seem to have gotten, breathed in the spores and got pulmonary anthrax, which is the most dangerous. Actually, all 5 people who died of pulmonary anthrax. But they breathed it in because they picked it up in the mail sorting room, wherever these letters were going through. They were getting pounded, the letters, by machines. The spores were so small they could actually go through the pores in the paper. And these poor guys breathed it in and died. And all the 5 people who died were that sort of ordinary citizen. And I think this is part of the profile of this attack. With the 9/11 attacks, people could be scared, they could feel awful, but they could also think, I don't live in New York City, or I don't live near the Pentagon, or, I'm not in the World Trade Center. I don't really have to personally worry. But with the anthrax attacks, it became clear that anybody could get this, and anybody could die. And that's one of the reasons it was really very scary at the time. And, of course, you asked me about targeting. I mean, we could get into the 2 senators, Daschle and Leahy, later in some detail. I think it's very clear why they were targeted.
Oh, why? Tell me.
Oh, well, in my book, I try to go in some detail through the whole relationship of the anthrax attacks to the Patriot Act, and it would be boring to try and go through it in detail here. But the gist is that I think that 9/11 and anthrax were 2 phases of one operation. You can think of it as the 9/11/anthrax operation. It was a 1-2 punch delivered to the United States, or more accurately, delivered to the U.S. population and to Congress, because I think that's an important aspect of this, by parties which we could speculate about later. And it had 2 main intentions, I think. One is to empower the U.S. executive and to disempower the legislative branch, so that it could take the nation to war against whoever it wanted to go to war against. And at the same time, to empower the intelligence and military communities with respect to, that is, over against the population as a whole, by taking away people's rights. So, in other words, getting the power to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq is the external manifestation of this. It's what you do abroad. And what you do at home, what you do domestically, is pass the USA Patriot Act and also begin the mass NSA spying. Both of those things began in the fall. Both of them began around the time we're talking about. And the Patriot Act very likely would not have got passed by Congress without the anthrax attacks. That's why it's one of the reasons we have to remember these attacks. 9/11 shocked Congress, yes. And that's when the Attorney General said, oh, my God, look at this. We got to give more power to intelligence agencies. And, and so we're going to bring in this new bill. But the bill was starting to be slowed down. It was getting resistance, not only the U.S. population as a whole, but also in Congress. And they were starting to challenge parts of it. And they were saying, wait a minute, why should we pass this scary thing so quickly? And that's where the anthrax attacks came in. And they scared the population. Congress was repeatedly threatened. The Congress people were told not to wear their badges, not to look like Congress people in public, not to use their special license plates. Congress was surrounded with concrete barriers and yellow police tape. This intimidation of Congress went on for a couple of months while the anthrax attacks while the Patriot Act was making its way through Congress, and it was finally signed into law under this kind of bullying and pressure on October 26th. And when Mr. Bush gave a little speech after signing this, he directly referred to the anthrax attacks. He basically said, look, we're up against terrorists who have no sense of morality at all. Look at what they've just done. They've just sent anthrax. Of course, it turned out later this wasn't from Islamic extremists at all. It had nothing to do with Islamic extremists. But this was the story, and this was what was supposed, in my view, of course I'm giving my interpretation here, this was the purpose of this twofold operation: to intimidate, to scare, When this was done in Europe, it was called the strategy of tension. You actually purposely intimidate the population and representative bodies so that you can empower other groups to do what they want.
I mean, you mentioned that the Congress was being told not to wear their badges. They were being told not to do this. They were being told not to do that. Who was telling them?
Well, I would have to look back to see who said this specifically, but certainly the FBI is directly implicated in this. I mean, you know, the FBI said on several occasions that, oh my God, there's al-Qaeda is definitely going to carry out an attack soon because we're going to be, you know, bombing Afghanistan. And so we all have to prepare for this. And buildings in Washington are a major going to be a prime target, and we're going to have to worry about biological weapons along with chemical weapons. They're saying all this from quite an early time. Also, a whole bunch of high-ranking members of the U.S. executive, from the president to the vice president to the health minister, Donald Rumsfeld, Andrew Card, they all came out of the woodwork to give warnings that, you know, unconventional weapons were probably, or there's a good chance they would soon be used. These warnings they're giving, by the way, before Robert Stevens is diagnosed as having anthrax. Nobody has been diagnosed as having anthrax at this point. There is supposed to be no public knowledge of any anthrax in play at all. And yet already these guys are coming out, they're giving one speech after another around September 30th, especially October 1st, around that time, you know, saying how we have to be careful and definitely Congress will be one of the possible targets, and making the link to passing the Patriot bill. Cheney said he wanted it passed by Senate by October 5th. He was quite explicit about that. And then these two senators held it up so that it wasn't passed by October 5th. And immediately they get sent anthrax letters.
The letters were mailed on the 18th, 9 days later?
No. There are two waves of letters.
Right.
And here, I know that I'm giving a lot of information. For people who aren't used to this, I'm sure it's confusing. The first anthrax letters went out around September 18th.
Okay.
But the ones I'm talking about now, the letters sent to senators, went out later than that. What I'm saying is that the Vice President Cheney said that he wanted the Patriot Act to be passed by Senate by October 5th. Two Democratic senators held it up so that it wasn't passed by October 5th. That was Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy. And somewhere between October 6th and 9th, in other words, very, very soon after this deadline was missed, two anthrax letters were sent off to guess who? Senators Daschle and Leahy. I mean, that's not coincidence in my view. That is clearly an attempt to intimidate precisely the two people who are holding up the Patriot Act.
Right. And I think I recall that they made some public statements.
Oh, well, I mean, you mean before they got the attacks?
After they got the attacks, that they weren't sure, they weren't convinced, that they weren't satisfied with the investigation and what had been uncovered.
Oh, I see, yes. That's especially Senator Leahy. He made eventually made some very strenuous statements publicly that he was not satisfied with the FBI's conclusion that Bruce Ivins, acting alone, had done this. Mr. Leahy said, I believe there are others who were involved and who could be charged with murder. And he was angry when he said it. Of course he was angry. People were killed. He himself was targeted. Mm-hmm. And I think he's clearly right. This was a job done by a group of people. It wasn't done by any lone wolf. I was disappointed when I listened to the interview with Richard Lambert that you did, that he seems to not only buy the 9/11 story, but also still thinks that there was a lone wolf that carried out the anthrax attacks. I don't think there's any way an individual did that.
Now, also, too, in the two waves of the anthrax letters going out, one was a much better strain of anthrax than the first strain. So
that's right. The second posting, if you like, was much more sophisticated, high-grade, scary stuff. When the intern working for Tom Daschle in the Hart Senate building opened the envelope, this stuff basically floated out and contaminated the entire building, which then had to be closed down for several months while it was cleaned. And you had senators wandering around, some of them without a proper office while they were considering the Patriot Act. Some of them had no access to computers. Some of them were sitting around here and there working with pads of paper. And now to have one little envelope, contaminate a big building that quickly, that takes a lot of work. That was aerosolized anthrax spores. It was very sophisticated. It was, in my view, clearly weaponized. I know the FBI still regards this as controversial, but I think we have no choice but to say this was weaponized, highly sophisticated stuff, not easy to make, and more sophisticated, yes, than the first round.
Second batch. Did I lose you?
No, I don't think it was a different group. I mean, I don't pretend to be able to explain everything.
Yeah.
So I remember you asked Richard Lambert why the two lots of anthrax were different. He said, I don't know. And that's basically my answer, too. I don't know. I could speculate, but I don't really like to speculate. Do I think it was two groups? No. I think it was one group, and they had access to different kinds of anthrax, and why they would decide to use the more sophisticated lot in the second version, I don't know.
Then who would have access to two different quality versions of anthrax? Not your average person, obviously.
Well, no, not your average person. Again, I noticed that Mr. Lambert was being very cautious when you asked him whether this was domestic, whether this came from a domestic source. And he talked a little bit about how al-Qaeda had been trying to, make anthrax. Whatever al-Qaeda is and whatever it may or may not have been trying to do, I don't think al-Qaeda had anything to do with making this anthrax. I think this was very sophisticated stuff, and that it did come from probably one of three U.S. laboratories, either Battelle, Dugway, or USAMRIID, and probably one of the first two. And the more people study these spores, the more they have tended to emphasize the sophistication of this stuff. And I go into this in my book. I talk about two articles that appeared in 2011 and 2012 authored by three scientists, Hugh Jones, Rosenberg, and Jacobson. I won't go into it in detail here, but their conclusion is that this anthrax was extremely sophisticated, that it went through, the spores had been microencapsulated, probably by silicon with a tin catalyst, and that this is very exotic work, and that no individual could have done this. Certainly al-Qaeda couldn't have done it, and that it seemed to have come from the bowels of the bioweapons program by a state. And of course, they're thinking of the U.S. as the state, the country in question. And they think it probably came from either Dugway Proving Ground, or Battelle Memorial Institute. Both of those are associated with the military and with the CIA.
So it would be highly unlikely that it was the North Koreans or another foreign government.
There's never been any evidence that it was the North Koreans.
Well, not specifically, but you know what I mean.
There's no evidence that North Korea or Iraq or al-Qaeda even had the Ames strain of anthrax, much less that they would have been able to treat it in this way and produce this sophisticated product. I mean, there was a strong attempt in October 2001 to implicate al-Qaeda and Iraq, and I go through that in my book. I think the plan was to really finger what I call the double perpetrator, meaning al-Qaeda had the responsibility of putting the stuff in envelopes, writing the crude little letters, Allah is great, all this nonsense, sending it through the mail. But that al-Qaeda couldn't have made this stuff. And so they got it from Iraq. So you have the state supplier, and then you have the terrorist proxy, this dual terrorist group. There were lots of people that had begun pushing that theory in October. But it fell apart, it fell apart. The scientific evidence was against it, and there was no evidence that these guys had gotten a hold of the AIM strain. ABC News made a brave attempt to, and I'm being sarcastic here, to implicate Iraq right at the end of October by claiming that the anthrax spores had bentonite, and that bentonite had been used to help weaponize them. Bentonite is a kind of clay. It's used in kitty litter. And they said, this was Saddam Hussein's signature because only Iraq uses bentonite. Well, it was just false. There was no bentonite. Thanks for trying to implicate Iraq, guys, but, it didn't work. So then that story failed as well. There's never been any evidence that Iraq or al-Qaeda or any state inimical to the U.S. like that was involved.
Okay. Let's take a little break.
Yep.
Commercial break. We're here with Graeme MacQueen, the author of 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. And he also has a website that he contributes to called consensus911.org. We'll be right back with more after these messages. And now, a word from our sponsors. Pacific West Bamboo, your premier source for sustainable building material. They provide construction-grade and craft-grade bamboo material for all your indoor, outdoor, and gardening needs. Contact them for event planning and display building as well. 503-839-8126. Or you go to their new website, pacificwestbamboo.com. Or you can contact them on Facebook at Pacific West Bamboo. That's 503-839-8126. Amanda from Pacific West Bamboo was our first sponsor. She's been so good to us, so please support her in return. I want to make everybody aware of our new members section at www.oppermanreport.com. You can go there and sign up for a monthly, quarterly, or yearly subscription. You can even purchase episodes one by one. You get full access to brand new original content, new guests, new uncensored interviews, my own investigations and reports, and we're going to be adding sections with documents, images, police reports, either provided by myself or by my guests, or for my own investigations, my own reports. So you can go to oppermanreport.com and you can sign up there tonight. You can start listening tonight. Strawman. I want to mention Strawman. Strawman is a band out of Toronto, Canada. They're good friends of the Opperman Report. They're a trio of guys who share the same mindset most of us here do, and they put that energy into their words and music. So check them out at strawmanmusic.com and drop them a line to let them know that you heard them here on the Opperman Report. We'll be doing an interview with Sean Duffy soon. You can get an autographed copy of my book, How to Succeed as a Private Investigator, by visiting my PI website, emailrevealer.com. We also offer a computer and cell phone forensics. We can recover deleted text messages to uncover infidelity. We offer asset searches, locates, email tracing, background reports, and we can even trace your spouse's email address back to internet dating websites to catch them cheating online. You can reach us at 800-572-9762, or you can email me at emailrevealer@aol.com. New World Mexican Women. Everyone loves the New World Mexican Women, and their line of fine, handcrafted, authentic Mexican jewelry of stone mosaic and abalone stone inlay. In their first book, titled New World Mexican Women, available on lulu.com, they teach you how to make this jewelry, and they have a collection of love letters to their men from their hometown that have immigrated to the United States to find work. They have also published a new book entitled Azukina to the Rodeo. It's about a young girl that falls in love with a rodeo bull rider, and she runs away with him without telling her family. You can find the New World Mexican Women by Googling New World Mexican Women. And you can ask them about their deals on wholesaling, their fine jewelry, and all of the other projects that they have going on. If you'd like to have your business or website advertised here and promoted all over the world on dozens of stations every day, give us a call at 800-572-9762 or email oppermanreport@gmail.com. And now back to our show. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. Investigator Ed Opperman, and we are here tonight with Graeme MacQueen. I got caught off guard there. Okay, but we're back because I was looking. We have an event coming up. If Amanda's out there, our sponsor from Pacific West Bamboo, if you're out there, I want to promote that event you're going to be appearing at in the mid-October. Over there in San Francisco, there's going to be that guy Densmore from the Doors, and Tom Hayden's going to be there, and it's a big event. Amanda has a booth down there promoting her bamboo products. Now but we're here right tonight. We got Graeme MacQueen, the author of 2001 Anthrax Deception: The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. The link to that book is on the Opperman Report blogspot.com and also OppermanReport.com bookstore. Now we've pretty much ruled out. Okay, fine. It wasn't, and I just was facetiously saying North Korea, like another country. It wasn't.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's not that. Okay. Now, what about the possibility that a big U.S. corporation, like a big or multinational corporation, like a Halliburton, like a big China company, that has like Blackwater guys and they can hire scientists, could they have pulled this off?
Yeah, excuse me. I don't think they could have done it by themselves. Excuse me. We talk about the military-industrial complex, sometimes military-industrial intelligence complex, a little better because the intelligence community is very important here. But if we mean that term seriously, then of course we do include industry, and we do keep our minds open to the possibility that corporations can be involved as partners in some of the dark deeds here. So I don't rule such corporations out at all as partners, but I think they could do it on their own. I think that they would need partners within the state apparatus itself. Now, there are various ways to picture this. Peter Dale Scott, who lives in California, has been writing for some years about deep politics and increasingly also about the deep state. And these are interesting concepts. The deep state is useful. He uses it to refer to kind of a web of different people who are connected by common interests, and some are in the formal state apparatus. In other words, they may be as high as the vice president or the president. They could be, the head of the FBI. They could be whatever. Others are not in the formal state apparatus. That means they don't have jobs working for the government, for example. They may be in private industry. They may be freelance, whatever. But they're part of this network. They're part of this web. And together, these form a very potent group that's usually very well funded, has deep ties within the intelligence community and within the military, and is able to steer, in some ways, the whole country in certain directions through deception, through covert action, through various kinds of propaganda and persuasion. This is an unelected body. This is an invisible body. And this deep state is something that we need to be concerned about. And I don't think you need to be paranoid in order to imagine that such a thing exists. So, for example, it may be the case that somebody could be the head of an intelligence operation or agency, FBI, CIA, whatever, and that's their public position, and everybody sees them and knows them in that capacity, but it could be that they are at the same time part of this other organization. It doesn't have to be a formal organization, may not have a name, but part of the deep state, and in that capacity, they are achieving their aims through deception and sometimes violence outside the public eye. Now, of course, the possibility of paranoia exists here. If we have no evidence for such a body, then what's the point of even imagining it? But I think we do have evidence for such a body, and I think the things that happened in the fall of 2001 in the U.S., the 9/11 attacks and the Anthrax attacks, are evidence of such a network or such a body. And that's one of the reasons we need to study these operations to see how this could have been pulled off. Was private industry involved? Was the intelligence community involved? Who would you have needed in order to pull these off? These are very good questions.
Yeah, because Lambert, we keep going back to Lambert, but he seemed to say, he said, I don't know what he really felt, but what he said was that he felt it was this political infighting that caused such sabotage to his investigation.
Yeah, I heard him say that, and I have no reason to doubt the man's sincerity. He seems loyal, basically, to the FBI, DOJ, Department of Justice, even though the rather cautious and rather loyal man that I heard in your interview is not quite the same man that I, when I read the text of the lawsuit he brought against the FBI and the Department of Justice, the man there is an angry man. He's a fierce man, a very smart man, at times sarcastic, even amusing man, who is obviously very gutsy. He's tired of having his career ruined, being blackballed, being punished for being a whistleblower on the Anthrax case, and he's not going to take it anymore. That's what I read in the text. When he speaks publicly on your show, I hear a slightly different man, a man who has certain loyalties, certain caution. And again, what can I say? I respect him for that. That's fine, but that's not where I'm coming from at all. I don't think the case was sabotaged out of just personal ego. I think the FBI, at least certain high-up elements in it, not everybody obviously, was purposely sabotaging the investigation because their job was to cover the tracks of the real perpetrators and to pin it all on this poor guy, Bruce Ivans.
Before we get to Ivans, because one thing that I was always, and I know we're jumping around a little bit.
It's okay.
Yeah, but again, back to Robert Stevens.
Yeah.
Now, you were going to say some things. There's been some rumors about that building.
Yeah.
What have you heard?
Oh, well, there are two very different interpretations that are often given as to why the AMI building, America Media Incorporated, where Robert Stevens was working, was targeted. Very different approaches. And I really only discuss one in my book. The one I don't discuss is where some people say, well, Robert Stevens was only a photo editor. Yes, but he had been responsible for including some photos in one of these tabloids of the President Bush's, daughter or daughters. And they were very unflattering and they were very insulting. And some people think that he was targeted by the executive of the U.S. in vengeance for that. Well, of course, how do I know? I mean, it could be, but I don't like to be quite that speculative. And so in my book, I don't even go there. I'm more interested in the other set of connections. And that is that the tabloid that Robert Stevens worked for. It was called The Sun. It was a sister publication of the National Enquirer, and it was located in, Boca Raton in the American Media Incorporated building. The editor of The Sun was a man named Mike Irish, and his wife, Gloria, was a real estate agent. Now, Gloria, as it turns out, was a real estate agent for two of the so-called 19 hijackers.
Oh, boy, that's right. I forgot that part.
Yeah, well, it's kind of important because think of the odds, right? I mean, so she had found apartments for al-Shehi and al-Ghamdi, two of the 19 guys. And in the end, those apartments became, they housed, it's either 4 or 5 of the 19 hijackers, and the location was claimed to be a kind of hotbed for the so-called 9/11 hijackers. Well, that's an interesting connection. If we look into it further, we find Gloria Irish was not just the real estate agent for the so-called hijackers. She was also Robert Stevens' real estate agent. She had, she knew Robert Stevens, the first guy to die from anthrax. She had found his house for him. She and her husband, Mike, were old friends of Robert Stevens. There are all kinds of other connections, too, that several of these, and you put hijackers in quotation marks. You should always think of the term hijacker in quotation marks, because in my view, they didn't hijack anything. But anyway, the so-called 19 hijackers, you had several of them working out in a gym where several of the AMI people worked out. You had Mohammed Atta, supposedly renting planes from the same airport that Mike Irish, rented planes from. He flew private planes, and so on and so forth. And these kind of alleged coincidences pile up, and after a while you go, I'm sorry, I can't buy this. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think somebody was, either there's a real and direct, interesting connection between the people who did the 9/11 attacks, so-called hijackers, and the people who did the anthrax attacks, and there's a lot of evidence that somebody's trying to make us think this, or fictions were created, connections were created to make us think that the two were connected, to make us think that the same guys who hijacked airplanes on 9/11 were also involved in the anthrax operation. And in my book, I give the reasons why I think the second option is the right one. In other words, that an elaborate script, so to speak, was written that would convince investigators that these 19 Arab guys hijacked planes, but that they were also involved in preparing for a bioweapons attack on the U.S., and that therefore the same group, al-Qaeda, was involved in both sets of attacks. And what I say in the book is that theory was actually pushed quite hard initially in the fall of 2001, but it fell apart. Why did it fall apart? It fell apart when it was shown that the anthrax didn't come from al-Qaeda, didn't come from Iraq. It came from a U.S. lab serving the military-industrial complex. And at that point, it became very dangerous for the actual perpetrators to have people look upon these two operations as connected. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Because if they're connected and the anthrax attacks are frauds which started in the U.S. military-industrial complex, then people are going to draw the obvious conclusion that the 9/11 attacks were also a fraud that came from the military-industrial complex. And so what I say in my book is that the FBI, as well as a variety of other groups, have been steering us frantically for years away from this theory that they were connected. Try to get us to forget about the anthrax attacks. Try to get us to believe that there's no connection between those and the 9/11 attacks, because they're afraid that since the anthrax attacks have gone down, the official story collapsed, that will contaminate the 9/11 collapse too, and they definitely don't want that to happen, because that's the keystone for the whole global war on terror.
Couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, are you familiar with Daniel Hopsicker's work on looking into the supposed hijackers down there in Florida and the flight schools and all that stuff?
Right.
Are you familiar with it?
A little bit, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, he looked into Muhammad Atta's girlfriend and and the use of all kinds of alcohol and drugs by these guys and all the un-Islamic things they were doing.
Okay, and also the other thing is, what do you make of Rudy Giuliani forming a company that cleans up Anthrax and buying that building?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but yeah, I think they're all connected. I think that's highly fishy. What can I say? I haven't looked into that one in detail, but I'm certainly aware of it.
Like $40,000.
I do think they were part of the same operation, 9/11 and Anthrax, and we were initially supposed to believe that it was all one operation. And as I say, once the Anthrax story collapsed and the whole thing was traced to the U.S. military-industrial complex, then they're frantically telling us they aren't connected. They aren't connected. Forget it.
And now we're not even allowed to think about it. They don't even
That's
mention
right.
it.
We're not supposed to think about it.
I'm the only one bringing it up. I'm probably going to get in trouble for it.
Yeah.
Oh, brother. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I guess now we can start looking into the cast of suspects.
Okay.
You think so? It's a good time?
Well, go for it. I mean, I don't really try in my book to name too many specific names, but we can, in a general way, we can do that, yeah.
What do you make of the whole Hatfield?
What do you mean, what do I make of it?
Yeah, like as a viable suspect. Now, he sued the FBI and he won, I think, $5 million, right?
You're talking about Hatfield.
Yeah, Hatfield, yes.
Right. What do I make of him?
Yeah.
Well, there's some Anthrax researchers that I know who think he was involved and that getting the $5 million was a way of paying him off to be quiet. All I can say is, well, it could be, but I've never seen any convincing evidence that he was one of the perpetrators, any more than I've seen convincing evidence that Bruce Ivins was. And the way I look at this is, the burden of proof is on those who accuse these people. It's not up to me to prove these guys were innocent. It's up to the cops or the FBI in this case to prove they were guilty. They failed with Stephen Hatfield. The judge threw it out. That's why he got his $5-some million. And I think if Bruce Ivins had not suddenly died shortly before they were hoping to charge him with the crime, he too would have beaten them. I don't think their case was very weak against Bruce Ivins. And as Mr. Lambert admitted on your show, well, this is a complicated issue. Maybe you don't want to go into it, but I don't think the FBI scientific evidence that tried to link Ivins to the actual anthrax spores, I think that was so weak that it wouldn't have even been allowed before a jury. It wouldn't have made it through the Daubert hearings where you have to show that this is good science and you can bring it before a judge or a jury. It wouldn't have even made it through that. We know that now. I mean, the Government Accountability Office came out with a report in December 2014 which admitted that. And Mr. Lambert basically admitted it too on your show. What this really means is that the strongest part of the FBI's case against Bruce Ivins, the strongest part, is so weak it would not be allowed before a jury. They wouldn't even get to hear it. So that tells you how weak the FBI's case really is.
Well, yeah, the whole thing with Ivins is so bizarre to begin with because he became a suspect because he was actually hired by the FBI to be part of the investigation.
Well, you could be right. I don't know if he was hired in the sense of paid for it or not. He certainly helped them in the early stages. He was a very well-respected anthrax scientist and researcher who was working on developing a proper anthrax vaccine. He had published many papers. He was well-respected. He wrote about, I wonder who could have done this. And the FBI consulted him. As I say, I don't know if they actually hired him or not. But anyway, they turned on him. And they decided at one point that he was a good person to nail with this crime. I think part of the reason they turned on him, and here I'm speculating, okay, But I think one of the reasons they turned on him is because they thought he was a vulnerable individual, that he might fit the profile of the famous lone nut. He had some emotional and mental health issues. He was at times he was in a bad way, apparently on medication, and he really had trouble once they started putting pressure on him. Talking to his wife and kids, coming in to interview him at work, he got extremely stressed out, and it's quite possible that he did, in fact, take his own life in the end, which is that's the official story. Well, okay, it's quite possible he did. It's also possible someone just killed him. I don't know. I don't imagine we'll ever know. But anyway, that's, I think, why they chose him. But the case against him has always been weak. And now we have Mr. Lambert bravely coming out and saying that there is, quote, a wealth of exculpatory evidence. He said that in the written text of his filing his lawsuit, and he also said it on your show. What he's saying is that there's a lot of evidence that suggests he was innocent, and it still hasn't been made public, at least not to the U.S. public in general. He said maybe Congress has it. He doesn't know, but the U.S. public certainly doesn't. And he knows what it is, but he's not going to tell us, unfortunately. I think that's very interesting. I'm not surprised. I wrote my book. My book was published before Mr. Lambert came forward. And already in the book, I'm saying, well, there's no good evidence. There's never been any good evidence that Ivans did this. And I feel very sorry for Ivans. I feel very sorry for his family. I think this is a disgrace. Assuming he did commit suicide, it appears that the FBI drove him to it. And what? Now they get off scot-free? This whole process really stinks.
The whole business with Ivans, too, about wasn't there an issue with his therapist? I believe she got a restraining order against him, or she had some kind of issues herself.
Yes, and I don't remember the details, so I can't really tell you much about that. But it's true. There was a woman who had worked with him who claimed that, as I recall it, that she considered him dangerous, not merely mentally unstable, but dangerous, and so on and so forth. And the FBI made a fair bit out of this, that trying one of several methods they used to try and implicate him in the Anthrax attacks. And then it turned out, yes, that she had some issues herself, and I don't remember what those were, whether she had a criminal record or something, but there were a lot of fishy things about her, which made us wonder whether pressure had been brought to bear on her. But the way I look at it, I read, as soon as they came out with their so-called Anthrax document, the FBI, in which they basically made their case in writing against Ivans. He's guilty. We're closing the case. Here's the document. I read it carefully, and I thought, oh, you guys should be ashamed of yourself. This is such weak stuff here. You try and find anything you can do to blacken the guy's reputation. You try and find somebody who says he's dangerous. You try and find obsessions about, young college co-eds or something, and maybe he has a titillating email exchange with one of his female co-workers, or another co-worker. He says, I'm feeling really unstable and stressed right now, and you drag it all up, even if it has nothing to do with being an anthrax killer. And you put it all out there for the public. You read this and you kind of begin thinking, well, they could do this to anybody, right? They have access to so much of our private information now, and they could make any of us look nutty or violent. And this is one of the reasons that the invasion of our privacy with all these bills is so dangerous. They just dragged all this stuff from poor Bruce Ivans up, even if it had nothing to do with anthrax.
Right. You just reminded me. It was so tenuous. It was so ridiculous that one of the envelopes was mailed from a mailbox that was nearby a storage unit that was owned by this sorority.
Yeah. Supposedly he had been obsessed with this particular sorority, these girls, and they had a building that was not too far from a mailbox where the anthrax letters may have been mailed from. They couldn't even show that he had gone to that mailbox. that he'd put anything in the mailbox. They couldn't find any anthrax spores in his house or on his person or in his car. They couldn't prove he'd driven there on the dates in question. They didn't have any hard evidence. This is all kinds of speculation, very weak stuff.
But he did make some bizarre statements. They're described as non-denial denials. And he was describing memory loss and waking up and dressed and all kinds of stuff. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm not sure which things you're referring to. I certainly read very carefully the FBI's case against him, and they quote various emails and things he said to people, but I don't find anything that comes even close to being a confession. He knows they're closing in on him. Right. He says at one point, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not quite these words, but it's close. He said, "The state demands its blood sacrifice, and it's now become clear that I am to be that sacrifice." But that's not a confession. At one point, he expresses some feeling of guilt, but it's not guilt because he did it. It's guilt because at one point he thinks he may have been careless, in being the custodian of the famous flask. What was it, RM 1029 or something? And that maybe the perpetrators somehow got hold of that anthrax from that flask. Well, okay, that's legitimate guilt, but he doesn't say, "I did it." As far as I know, he always said he didn't do it. He said he didn't do it. He said he couldn't have done it. He said he had no idea how to produce the anthrax that was in those envelopes. He didn't have the technical expertise.
Okay, great. Okay, we're here with Graeme MacQueen. He's the author of a 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. You can find the link to his book on OppermanReport.com and OppermanReportBlogspot.com. And also he contributes to a website called Consensus911.org. We'll be right back with more with Graeme MacQueen right after these messages. And now a word from our sponsors. Pacific West Bamboo, your premier source for sustainable building material. They provide construction-grade and craft-grade bamboo material for all your indoor, outdoor, and gardening needs. Contact them for event planning and display building as well. 503-839-8126. Or you go to their new website, pacificwestbamboo.com. Or you can contact them on Facebook at Pacific West Bamboo. That's 503-839-8126. Amanda from Pacific West Bamboo was our first sponsor. She's been so good to us, so please support her in return. I want to make everybody aware of our new members section at www.oppermanreport.com. You can go there and sign up for a monthly, quarterly, or yearly subscription. You can even purchase episodes one by one. You get full access to brand new original content, new guests, new uncensored interviews, my own investigations and reports, and we're going to be adding sections with documents, images, police reports, either provided by myself or by my guests, or for my own investigations, my own reports. So you can go to OppermanReport.com, and you can sign up there tonight. You can start listening tonight. Strawman. I want to mention Strawman. Strawman is a band out of Toronto, Canada. They're good friends of the Opperman Report. They're a trio of guys who share the same mindset most of us here do, and they put that energy into their words and music. So check them out at strawmanmusic.com and drop them a line to let them know that you heard them here on the Opperman Report. We'll be doing an interview with Sean Duffy soon. You can get an autographed copy of my book, How to Succeed as a Private Investigator, by visiting my PI website, emailrevealer.com. We also offer a computer and cell phone forensics. We can recover deleted text messages to uncover infidelity. We offer asset searches, locates, email tracing, background reports, and we can even trace your spouse's email address back to internet dating websites to catch them cheating online. You can reach us at 800-572-9762, or you can email me at emailrevealer@aol.com. New World Mexican Women. Everyone loves the New World Mexican Women, and their line of fine, handcrafted, authentic Mexican jewelry of stone mosaic and abalane stone inlay. In their first book, titled New World Mexican Women, available on lulu.com. They teach you how to make this jewelry, and they have a collection of love letters to their men from their hometown that have immigrated to the United States to find work. They have also published a new book entitled Azuquina to the Rodeo. It's about a young girl that falls in love with a rodeo bull rider, and she runs away with him without telling her family. You can find the New World Mexican Women by Googling New World Mexican Women. And you can ask them about their deals on wholesaling their fine jewelry and all of the other projects that they have going on. If you'd like to have your business or website advertised here and promoted all over the world on dozens of stations every day, give us a call at 800-572-9762 or email oppermanreport@gmail.com. And now back to our show.